The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Peace means taking into account the dignity of other people and the fact that there are other people who have certain rights.
Peace in the Middle East basically will come when the clergy in the mosque on Friday preach it and when the rabbis in the synagogue on Saturday preach it. During the time of Camp David, you had political leadership that was able to contain that type of religious fervor. What the country needs is some prescient understanding of what is going to happen in the future. Welcome to another Leon Charney Report, and this is obviously a different type of report. Usually you see me with a desk. You don't see me in such a comfortable chair. I may fall asleep tonight, but I have very interesting guests. On my right is Ambassador Dennis Ross, who is a terrific guy. He worked for the Bush administration and also President Clinton, so he's a hybrid. He worked for a Democrat and a Republican, and he's been a terrific negotiator in the Middle East. I think he's a little frustrated he couldn't get the thing done, but we'll talk about that later. On his right is Brian Daves, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yeshiva University. In case you're not watching us, we're coming from Yeshiva University's auditorium, and Marsha Robbins Wolf Scholarship Fund has put these scholars together for us in the name of Yeshiva University. On my left is Shibly Talhami, who is a professor at the University of Maryland, renowned scholar. And on his left is Avraham Sela, and he is a professor from Hebrew University. He was involved with me when we did the Camp David Peace Talks. We talked about it before, the successful Camp David Peace Talks with President Carter, which every Jew in the world we know is excited about. And he can tell you about how those days looked, and we'll go forward. So, we're going to begin the show. Dennis, we're going to ask you, if I say the name Yasser Arafat, what does that say to you?
It says several things to me. It says an icon of the Palestinian people, someone who put the Palestinian cause on the international map, but someone who could have made peace and didn't, someone who could have built an incipient state and didn't, someone who left a legacy for his people that is largely one of corruption and ineptitude and factions, and they're unfortunately having to deal with that now.
When did you meet him, Dennis? What year? Do you remember?
I can tell you exactly when I met him. The first day I met him was September 13th, 1993, at the White House on the day of the signing of the Declaration of Principles, the handshake. We couldn't deal with the PLO because the PLO was designated a terrorist organization. There had in fact been a dialogue that was established at the very end of the Reagan administration that the first Bush administration inherited, but that dialogue was constrained in that the only people who could take part in it were from our embassy in Tunis. That dialogue was suspended in June of 1990 because there was a terrorist act in Tel Aviv that Yasser Arafat would not condemn, and he would not even suspend from the executive committee of the PLO the person who had been responsible for it. So we had no contact with the PLO from then until September 9th, 1993, when the advance team of the PLO came to Washington to prepare for the handshake at the White House, and the very first meeting was in my office between myself and Nabil Shath. And then on September 13th is when I first met Arafat. After that, I probably spent more time with Yasser Arafat than any non-Palestinian. You
find that an encouraging fact of life?
I think I probably would be 6'5" now if I hadn't spent all that time with him.
All right, let me clue you in. When I met Arafat in 1986, I was sent there by Ezer Weitzman to visit him secretly in Tunis. And I came to Tunis, but he met people, as you know, 3 in the morning. That was his time to meet people. And when I met him, we spent a long time together. I was really trying, as Dennis said, it was illegal for an American diplomat to meet with him. During the hostage crisis, the Iranian hostage crisis, President Carter dispatched me to see Bruno Kreisky, who was then the Chancellor of Austria, and he wanted to bring in Sartawi, who, remember, he was a cardiologist who was a PLO supporter, and the President told me, no, you cannot meet with him, it's against foreign policy. I found Arafat, he promised to do things. I had asked him to free some MIAs, missing in action boys, and he said, yes, 2 weeks, we do it for you, and nothing happened. We tested his credibility. So I personally found him very intelligent but duplicitous. He would promise you one thing and then go the other way. Brian, did you ever meet Arafat?
No, I did not.
Did you?
I have. The first time I met him actually was a little earlier than Dennis. It was 1990. I was then an advisor to Lee Hamilton, who was then the chair of the House Subcommittee on Europe and the Middle East.
Indiana congressman.
Exactly. And I was dispatched to the Middle East to write a report in 1990 about the sentiment in the region after the end of the Cold War. There was a lot of anti-Americanism just before Iraq invaded Kuwait. There was an Arab Summit conference that had taken place the end of May, the end of June, no, the end of May, the beginning of June of 1990. And I went to Baghdad and was received and hosted there by the ambassador at the time, April Glaspie. And we sat at we went to a reception at the house of the Italian ambassador, and there we met the Egyptian ambassador, and April Glaspie found out that Yasser Arafat was still in town, and she asked me if I would not mind meet with him because I could do it unofficially, since I was not an official member of the government, and the government really wanted to have a report, and he wanted to convey a report. So that arrangement was fixed in that evening, and the next morning, prior to my departure from Baghdad, I went in thinking it was a last-minute meeting that he'll see me for half an hour. We ended up meeting for 3.5 hours, and that was I formed my first opinion of. What I did find about him is that when you talked to him, at some superficial level, he understood the strategic game, but one of the things that I went worried about is that he had such a superficial knowledge of American foreign policy that it troubled me deeply. And in fact, I said that in my report, that he knew I was going to convey.
Well, you know why, by the way. His alleged ambassador, Hassan Rahman, as we all know, Dennis, right?
Right.
Was sort of a half type of ambassador, but he was more sort of a playboy type. So I don't think he was following the foreign policy too heavily. And they didn't pay him very well, by the way.
I'm not sure it had to do so much with ambassador. I think the conventional wisdom about American foreign policy in the Middle East in general, and certainly it had a little bit to do with reporting, but frankly, Middle East leaders never looked at ambassadors as very critical. Until recently, Dennis knows the function of ambassador was very different, and they didn't rely on them, and they made their own impressions of them. But there was really a gap of understanding in much of the Arab world about American foreign policy until the last decade. The 1990s were really the exception to the rule, where many of the key Arab states developed a better appreciation for American foreign policy, and particularly how policy is made in Washington. At that time, he didn't have it.
It has to be said, and credit has to be given where credit is due, without Arafat, the Palestinian national movement would not have be what we know it today. Palestine would have been yet another forgotten conflict. He is the creator of the current Palestinian political identity, with the good and the ill that is in this political identity. I think, though, that Arafat has failed miserably to make the transition between a revolutionary leader and a leader of a future state. The way that he managed the Palestinian Authority, the corruption he allowed to happen in the Palestinian Authority, the lack of institutionalization that he created, the replication of the dysfunctionality that we saw in other Arab countries in terms of how he built the Palestinian Authority, I think we're still paying the price for that now.
I can tell you, I met him once when there was I would call it some kind of a journey of faculty of Ben-Gurion University where I worked at that time, to Hebron, and Yasser Arafat was there at that time. And we were received by him, and Ahmed Tibi, Knesset member Ahmed Tibi, represented each of the professors to Arafat. When when it came to my turn, he said this was Menachem Begin's cabinet secretary, and Arafat turned to me and said, Begin wanted very much to meet with me. And this was a lie. I know that this was a lie. More than that, I know that there was a certain Israeli politician who wanted to meet with Yasser Arafat at the time of the peace negotiations with Egypt, and Begin forbade it. It was forbidden by Begin.
Avram, did you ever meet Arafat?
No, but for almost 6 years, I had to watch his whereabouts and his intentions and his talks behind doors, and had to write estimates about it.
You wrote a book on Hamas, maybe the most important book in English today on Hamas. So I want to start with a question. Arafat's death and Hamas's re-election, tell me what that means.
I think it's a changing of the guards in the most comprehensive way one can think of. It's not just a normal change of government. It's a change of regime. It's a change of ideology. It's a different type of people who are now taking over, because the PLO, in many ways, and especially Fatah, incorporated some of the elite groups within the Palestinian people. Some of the more notable families, for example, became very much part of the PLO and Fatah. With Hamas, it's almost entirely based on refugees, and they represent a much lower status in socioeconomic terms. They come from a very clear background of refugees, and hence their program is much more militant, and they definitely see themselves as successors of Fatah and the PLO. They bring with them...
All right, so what happens to Abbas now?
Abbas is in trouble because he has to live together with a government that has an entirely different agenda from the PLO.
So can he live?
I think that...
would you write insurance on his life today?
I don't know if he himself would be a target, but definitely the situation right now is very tense.
But I just want to say, I mean, with Abu Mazen, I mean, he's still the president. He's in trouble for sure, but you know, he was elected as president. I mean, you have two parallel governments right now. That's the problem. And I think for now, neither side has really decided how to coexist with the other, or whether even to coexist with the other. That's part of the problem.
Even the most radical proposal, which is for Israel to annex all or large parts of the West Bank and give Palestinians either full or attenuated second-class citizenship or something, won't even let's say the most radical one of all, annex the whole West Bank and give all the Palestinians citizenship. And that's something that some settler movement people want. Let's say Israel did that. Would that end the conflict? No. The conflict would migrate to Gaza, led by Hamas, and it would have quite a bit of support, I would think, inside the new de facto Greater Israel from Palestinians there, because the Palestinians were not consulted. And again, with all unilateral gestures, the other party has no vested interest in making it work. So, of course, we will have negotiations again, because there is no other way to get to a conflict-ending solution.
All right, how do they get funded today?
Well, this is a difficult one, because clearly a lot of the funding comes from outside sources, and much of the international funding is drying up, particularly from Europe and the United States. They still obviously are getting some from other parts of the world, including Muslim countries, Arab countries, but even that, they're having a tough time transferring the funds directly to the Palestinian.
There's a reason, can I just say, there's a reason why they're having a hard time transferring the funds. The Palestinian Authority was so in debt that all the banks basically are taking whatever money is being transferred and saying, well, we're going to keep this money because this is what was owed to us.
It's called set-off.
At this point, it's not going to be easy for Hamas to be able to function if Hamas is going to maintain the posture that it has. The international community, for the most part, is cutting off Hamas. They basically
So what
are saying,
happens? Let's assume they cut them off.
Well,
Can there be a revolution there between the militias?
it depends on what happens at the same time. Do you cut off the Palestinian public? You know, Hamas and the Palestinian public are not necessarily the same thing.
So NGOs, non-government authorities will fund it?
They could. If the money goes through them, they could. That could be one of the ways.
It could also be used to buy rifles if it's funded incorrectly.
Well, the way you do it is you create a mechanism that is transparent. You create a kind of monitoring system to ensure that you know where the money's going. You identify what the particular projects are for the monies. And the fact is, the U.S. has an objective, and the objective is to have Hamas change or to fail. But if it fails, it has to be seen as failing because of their responsibility, not ours. That means you make sure you cut off Hamas, but you don't cut off the Palestinian public.
It's a tough thing to do. Let me bring Brian in. He's sitting here.
This actually raises a significant dilemma, though, because part of the reason why the funds aren't getting transferred partially has to do with the previous debt, but there's also an open threat on the part of the U.S. administration, which is that because we still have designated, since we designate Hamas as a terrorist organization, transferring funds to them would be in violation of U.S. policy, and international banks have said, and not only banks in Europe but also in the Arab world have said, that we're not going to risk retaliation from the United States government in the process of trying to transfer funds. The only problem with trying to move money toward non-governmental organizations and providing in terms of humanitarian assistance is much of the money that is needed is not just a matter of basic staples, but is also a matter of providing salaries so that the rest of the economy can possibly function.
I mean, one of the things that I'm worried about is I understand, you know, you put pressure on Hamas, sure, they have to change. There's no peace if they don't change. The problem right now is we are on automatic policy without addressing the consequences. We've looked in Iraq, look, there was a regime change, and we didn't plan, we didn't think about the consequences, and we're stuck with a mess. And right now, I think we cannot have a policy that can be devastating without thinking about the consequences. We've got to sit back and reflect a little bit.
All right, so we want to cover a lot of areas, and I want to get your intake from
with or
the PLO.
With or without resolution of the problem of financial aid to the government of Hamas, a showdown between the Fatah and Hamas is almost inevitable.
Mini civil war?
Something like that. They would have to decide who is at the helm, and this apparently is going to be decided by force.
But they're masters at avoiding making these kinds of choices.
Dennis, we'll be right back. We're going to take a break. We've got a lot of topics to get to, so we're going to get a little quicker answers here, because when I come back, I'm going to ask everybody what the scene would look like if Arik Sharon would be in good shape today, and what Ehud Olmert will do in terms of this Hamas problem. And obviously we'll talk about Kadima and the new alignment that was made today between the Labour Party and the pensioners, Rafi Eitan, and et cetera, et cetera. So we'll be right back.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Now get the book the hit movie was based on, Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels. Learn about the backdoor channel negotiations that led to the historic 1978 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Become a witness to history and order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Also available at all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at iTunes or Audible.com. Relive history. Order Backdoor Channels. Get best-selling author Leon Charney's latest book, The Battle of the Two Talmuds. Join Charney as he explores years of Jewish history to find out why and how Talmudic scholars and rabbis abandoned the Holy Land for the lands of the diaspora. Learn about the power struggles behind the creation of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. It's a book critics call engaging and enlightening. A book which will be of interest to people of every faith. Now available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or download the audiobook of The Battle of the Two Talmuds at iTunes or Audible.com. Leon Charney sets out to discover the true meaning of the Kaddish, the Jewish custom of reciting a prayer to commemorate the death of a close relative. Join Charney as he finds out the history of the Kaddish and how it has evolved. Reviewed as a refreshing walk through Jewish history and a book that deserves to be read by both Jews and non-Jews, The Mystery of the Kaddish is now available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at audible.com or on iTunes. Discover the mystery of the Kaddish. Available now over iTunes, Amazon, and Google Play. Leon Charney's cantorial CD in Disco Lam. Listen as Charney movingly sings El Moleh Rachamim and Charney's amazing rendition of a disco remix of Adon Olam, all sung in the incredible and individual Charney style. Also listen to the CDs on Rhapsody. Download Leon Charney's cantorial songs in Disco Lam, the disco remix of Adon Olam on Amazon, iTunes, and Google Play. Or listen in on Rhapsody. All available now.
Back, I'm Leon Charney. I'm talking to you with a live audience from Yeshiva University. We're having a very in-depth discussion with Ambassador Dennis Ross on my right, Brian Davies, a professor at the Yeshiva University in political science. On my left, Shibly Talhami, a professor at the University of Maryland, and Avraham Sela, professor at Yeshiva University, all experts on the Middle East, and all of us have exchanged a lot of interesting experiences that we had together. Avraham and I were talking about our days in Camp David I, the successful one, and he was in the intelligence corps, and I was helping President Carter and Ezra Weitzman at that time. Shibly was a very, very close friend of Ezra Weitzman, who was the former president of Israel. Dennis, I remember remarks about you from Weitzman after you used to visit him with Madeleine Albright, etc. I have them all in notes you don't have yet. Brian, you weren't there yet. You were busy trying to teach students at Yeshiva how to behave. So we're all together now. Okay, Arik Sharon. When was the last time you saw Arik Sharon, Dennis?
I saw him probably 6 months ago, 5 months ago.
Right before he got sick. Yeah. Brian, did you ever meet him?
I met him when he was the Minister of Industry and Commerce under Netanyahu.
That's a long time ago. Before, did you?
I met him, but I never had a one-on-one interaction with him.
Avram?
I met him a number of times. The
last time?
I actually saved his life once.
Tell us the story.
In 1966, I was an officer, and there was a big drill in the Galilee. And we put some 200 kilogram of explosives deep in the soil, and the purpose was to explode it and to prepare some trenches for mortars. And as I was preparing for doing this, I see a guy with a red beret walking there, just like that. I came close and I saw that it was Ariel Sharon, who was at that time the chief of the headquarters of the Northern Command. And I said, sir, you are standing here on something like 50 kilogram of explosives. He says, are you serious? I said, of course. And he said, get out of here, just like this. And so I was waiting until he finished his business there. And
the last time
It is very dangerous and a huge mistake to prejudge people and write them off. Ariel Sharon was someone that, had you asked me back in the mid-90s, I would say he is a mass murderer doomed to hell, and rightly so. Yet he became one of those Israeli leaders who really changed the shape of the region. I would even say Sadat. Look at Sadat. We're talking about Camp David I. Sadat was appointed deputy president to Abdel Nasser, to Gamal Abdel Nasser, for one specific reason. He was seen as too weak and a guy who was lacking in imagination. So he was appointed because he wanted a nobody to be your number two. Well, this nobody took the most courageous decision that any Arab leader in modern history has taken. And therefore, I think we do not write anyone off, yet we need, what we don't need is to look for people who look like us and think like us and think that they represent us. So while the Israeli peace camp is a friend and will always be a friend, it only reflects one side of Israel. And you have to look at those who reflect the other side. You never take your friends for granted, yet you have to be equally on the Palestinian side. Those who speak good English and say things that rhyme with our Western, American, Israeli sensibilities, these are friends that we have to always work with and support. Yet we have to reach out to those who share, at least everyone who shares the core basic objective that we have. The objective of two states living side by side in peace and security.
But what does that mean to the Middle East? And then we'll talk about Ehud Olmert. Tell me, Dennis, what you think it would look like if Hamas won the election, which he saw, and Sharon would become the prime minister. Allegedly, he would have had about 40 mandates with Kadima.
Well, I guess I'd make several observations. Number one, he settled on a concept. The concept was separation. He settled on that concept before Hamas won. Hamas's winning would have cemented that notion, because the logic of separation was there isn't a Palestinian partner, but we have to shape our own future and not make it dependent upon either Palestinian dysfunction or Palestinian rejection. Hamas's winning would be the embodiment of rejection and prove that separation was the right concept. So I don't believe that he would have changed the basic pathway. He would have more authority in carrying it out, because he had more personal authority. B, he had the kind of credibility that allowed him to pursue policies, as we saw, that many felt weren't even possible. I mean, I'll tell you an interesting story. At the time, shortly after he announced that he was going to disengage from Gaza, a colleague of mine from the Clinton administration, who was a senior official in the Clinton administration, bet me that he would not be able to do it, that the weight of the settler community would be too great, the level of opposition would be too great, and he wouldn't be able to do it. And I said, I'll take that bet. He's a bulldozer. A lot of times I've dealt with him in the past when that bulldozing I wasn't always that thrilled by, but I can tell you, if he makes a decision, he does it. He's made this decision. He will do it. And in a sense, he had the kind of authority that allowed him to proceed, and he would have proceeded probably more quickly than we will see a new Israeli government do now. It doesn't mean the new Israeli government isn't going to try to follow in his footsteps. After all, Ehud Olmert actually ran on a platform that was explicit.
Right.
And if you go back in time,
they both did 180 curve.
They did.
You know, they swung it all the way 180 degrees. But you know, the interesting story, Dennis, is that when Sharon became the prime minister of Israel, Ruby Rivlin told me this story. The first thing he did is he went to Tel Aviv and sat on a chair of Ben Gurion. So in his heart, he might have been a laborite. We don't know.
Well, he was an old labor Zionist.
Right.
And that's who his parents were. That's where he came from.
Right.
People who thought he was driven by ideology misread him. He had a concept of security. And like the old Mapiniks, they defined, in a sense, in the end, their need to create a border on their own. And he would do that. I think you have to understand one thing about Olmert, however. Olmert basically did something none of his predecessors did. When Prime Minister Rabin ran and won in 1992, he said, I won't deal with the PLO. And Oslo came. When Netanyahu ran, he ran against Oslo. But he did Hebron, and he did the Wye River Memorandum. In a sense, this is what took the ideology out of Likud.
I'll give you more. Olmert voted against the original Camp David agreement when he was in the Knesset.
I know.
So it's 180 twice.
I think that in the framework of peace, we have to separate ourselves entirely from the Palestinians. And the only way in which we can separate ourselves from the Palestinians is that we will withdraw from territories where Palestinians live. Namely, to the basis of 67 with minor adjustments and swap of territories. And this is what I proposed. One thing it must be clear, and I don't want to go into specific places at this point. I don't think that we can hold the territories per se. I mean, we have to pull out from approximately 94% of the territories, plus a fraction of a percent back and forth. And I think that the sooner we understand it, the better the chances are for peace, because we must understand that this withdrawal is essential for keeping Israel a democratic and Jewish state.
Shibly?
Well, you know, if the decision was already made to implement the unilateral withdrawal, not a negotiated settlement, and clearly Sharon was more on the unilateral side, and Olmert was, then certainly the election of Hamas would have been seen as an easy one, because as one Israeli said the last few days, Hamas is the perfect non-partner for an Israeli government.
That's very true, by the way.
Determined to carry on with it,
right.
with a unilateral. I think the problem is different, and I think that if the idea is to sell unilateralism to the international community and to the U.S., I think Hamas makes it easy. The Israelis can sell it. I think the problem is that's not going to solve the issue on the ground. I think what we have to worry about is not the ability of a government to sell a policy. That's one problem. That's an easy one. The problem is the consequences on the ground. And I don't think that whether it was Sharon or Olmert, if you have unilateralism with no engagement with the Palestinians and you have a collapsing Palestinian entity, Israel's going to be in trouble, the Palestinians are going to be in trouble, the Middle East is going to be in trouble, we in America are going to be in trouble. That's the problem, whether it was Sharon or Olmert.
Shibly, where were you born?
I was born in a village near Haifa, in Israel.
And you're a Christian Arab?
My family is a Christian Arab. I'm not a religious person, but...
Did you feel any segregation or discrimination when you grew up?
Sure. There's no question that, growing up in Israel as an Arab, you experienced it. It didn't mean, and Haifa was really one of the places where you had more coexistence than any other. I mean, there were families that were like best of friends, whether they're Jewish or Arab, that before the existence of the State of Israel continued to be one of the best cities for coexistence. But the reality was that Arabs in Israel, when I grew up, I left after high school, when I grew up, the reality was that Arabs, up until just 4 years before I left the country, were not even citizens, because the Arabs in Israel were not made citizens until 1966, and so
you felt discrimination.
There's no question, but I could tell you one thing, that I've been an observant of this over the years, and there's still discrimination, structural discrimination. I mean, whether it's economic, political, some of it is tied to politics, some of it is tied to the military service and non-military service, some of it is tied to the way the state is defined and structured.
You could not have served in the military.
If I had wanted to volunteer, I could have.
But you couldn't be conscripted.
I was not recruited,
right.
We're not obligated to. But I just want to say that over time, there's no question that Arabs acquired more and more rights in the state. So you can see that as an evolution over time, but it's certainly still not a relationship where you have full equality.
Avraham, aside from the question on the floor now, do you think Arik was really moved by the demographic issue, that he wanted to make sure that the borders that he could put together would be a guarantee that we would have a Jewish state? Was that running in his mind, or was the fact that he wanted this amount of land that he knew he could secure? Which was, or both?
I think he never mentioned the demographic factor.
Until lately.
Even after the disengagement from Gaza. He might have thought about it. Those people who know him closely say that this was the most important motivating factor behind the disengagement decision.
Which?
The demographic one.
Right.
At the same time, no one can take from the Palestinians the impact of the Intifada. This was going nowhere, and Israel could not find a real solution to this problem. Going into Gaza was out of question. It's densely populated. Israel would have shedded a lot of blood there, and probably the problem would never be resolved. So in many ways, the Palestinians did have a real achievement in this kind of war of liberation, and we have to admit it. And they learned from it that it is possible. And what is going on now is only a fraction of their capability shown to the Israelis. But I think that if the Israeli government would linger too much about leaving other territories, then we will see much more violence going on from the West Bank, because the Palestinians are talking now about another intifada that would liberate the West Bank, and probably another intifada that would liberate East Jerusalem. So we are now in a game in which one side learned that it is possible to put pressure on Israel.
As I've mentioned, it's something much more painful to both sides because it's cutting into the flesh at home, not somewhere beyond the normal borders. And there is the Arab Spring, which turned into a Muslim winter. It shadows the Israeli kind of sincerity. People ask themselves very seriously, you know, unlike what we have been told all the time, that our inability to solve the conflict with the Palestinians is the root cause of everything which is problematic in the Middle East. It ended up to be wrong. Even if I would have been successful in striking a deal with the Palestinians together with Clinton or Olmert in Annapolis or Rabin 20 years ago, the Muslim Brotherhood would still have taken over Egypt about this time. Syria would still be mired in terrible civil war, and Iran would still have tried to turn into military nuclear power. The reason, the causes of the major problems and the contradictions in the Middle East are much more profound than our conflict. So it's much more complicated in a way now, because we need, looking at what happened around us, we need even tougher security arrangements than before. And it's not easy to secure them without compromising the full sovereignty of the Palestinian state.
All right, we got to cut for a break. We'll come right back.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Now get the book the hit movie was based on, Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels. Learn about the backdoor channel negotiations that led to the historic 1978 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Become a witness to history and order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Also available at all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at iTunes or Audible.com. Relive history. Order Backdoor Channels. Get best-selling author Leon Charney's latest book, The Battle of the Two Talmuds. Join Charney as he explores years of Jewish history to find out why and how Talmudic scholars and rabbis abandoned the Holy Land for the lands of the diaspora. Learn about the power struggles behind the creation of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. It's a book critics call engaging and enlightening. A book which will be of interest to people of every faith. Now available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or download the audiobook of The Battle of the Two Talmuds at iTunes or Audible.com. Leon Charney sets out to discover the true meaning of the Kaddish, the Jewish custom of reciting a prayer to commemorate the death of a close relative. Join Charney as he finds out the history of the Kaddish and how it has evolved. Reviewed as a refreshing walk through Jewish history and a book that deserves to be read by both Jews and non-Jews, The Mystery of the Kaddish is now available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at Audible.com or on iTunes. Discover the mystery of the Kaddish.
We're back. I'm Leon Charney, and we are speaking from an auditorium for Yeshiva University. I must have full disclosure. I'm a graduate of Yeshiva University, and last year I was honored to get an honorary doctorate, and so that makes me a double alumni, which means I'd probably have to pay double alumni fees or something like that. And on my far right here is Brian Davies, who was teaching political science at Yeshiva University. He didn't teach me, I'm before him. Dennis Ross, who I reminded before, I said, Dennis, when's the last time I met you? And he was more correct than I was. I said, I met you in Syria. He said, yeah, you did. Wow. Our show was on a trip with President Clinton, and Dennis was there, and we got on the press plane together. And I don't know if he remembers or not, Didi Myers was the press secretary. And he looked a little bit dejected, because basically when you bring the President of the United States to a foreign country, you want something to be accomplished. And Assad was like a stone. I mean, he just didn't move. And I was sitting in the front row there, and I remember, I think it was Clyde Haberman or somebody from the New York Times. They were doing crossword puzzles, and Warren Christopher fell asleep, literally fell asleep. I don't know if you remember that, Dennis.
Yes, I do.
He was schluffing, as we say in French. On my left here is Shibly Talhami, a Christian Arab born in Israel, a very, very an American right now, and a scholar. But you were born in Israel,
was, yes.
Or Palestine.
Still an American.
Okay. Avraham Sela, who's still an Israeli, who's teaching from Hebrew University, and is really an authority on the Hamas and the whole issue of Hamas, which I think is very important. All right, Dennis, the Camp David one, where you were getting bar mitzvah, I was working to help put together, has held up.
Yes.
And Mubarak, whom you've met many, many times, in my opinion, has been a pretty decent guy. What's his role now in the Middle East?
I think that President Mubarak wants to continue to make Egypt a kind of centerpiece on almost all issues. But his own readiness to be taking broad steps, big leaps, has always been limited. You're right. I mean, he in a sense, inherited the Camp David Agreement because of the assassination of Anwar Sadat. And he has preserved the relationship, but he made sure it was a cold peace. He didn't make it into anything beyond that. And the kind of attitudes that were cultivated in Egypt, in the media, in their soap operas, was decidedly negative towards the Israelis. President Mubarak would make sure the relationship with Israel never fell below a certain point, but he never did a whole lot to cultivate it in a way that could have been particularly positive.
Because he was afraid of his own nationalistic...
Well, I think part of it was that he never wanted the Islamicists to join with the Nasserists. He wanted to be sure there would never be that kind of a coalition. But what is interesting, if you look at 1993 to 1994, Egypt actually was very active after Oslo, after the Declaration of Principles, until the first implementing agreement, which was concluded and signed in Cairo. Now, at that event, Yasser Arafat embarrassed Mubarak because he held up the signing in front of the world stage. He wouldn't sign, it turned out he wouldn't sign the maps until he got certain satisfaction on two issues which we had already resolved. It was all a show. But the interesting thing is, in the aftermath of that, Mubarak never again took a lead role. When things got really bad, he might invite the parties there. He might well support things we were doing. But I can tell you, when I negotiated the Hebron Agreement, actually the Egyptians made it more difficult to reach it. And even Arafat understood that and asked King Hussein to come in at the end to help. So Mubarak became much more cautious on the Israeli-Palestinian issue after that. He has played more of a role. His intelligence chief, Omar Suleiman, has played an active role, especially in terms of trying to broker understandings between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority before the election of Hamas. And even now, I think that they will continue to try to play some role, but look at what's going on in Egypt. The bombings in the Sinai now are something that are affecting Egypt's economy because they're going to affect tourism. They realize it's a deeper problem than they understood up until now. That, in all likelihood, is likely to make the Egyptians, I think, even more cautious in terms of what they'll actually do on the Palestinian issue and what they'll do vis-a-vis Hamas, even though their stake in making sure that Gaza doesn't somehow spill over into the Sinai is higher now than it was before.
How does the Iraqi war turn into that?
I don't think that the Iraqi war affects what he chooses to do in an explicit, direct way.
Indirectly.
But indirectly,
he wants to be the
that
leader
is
of the
more
Arabs.
a climate that is more negative is one that also makes him more cautious.
Look, Jordan did a horrible thing to the Palestinians. They were the occupiers of the West Bank, the way Egypt was of Gaza. And then one day the king realized that it's really not in his interest, so he just let go. So they became partners for peace only when Jordan sort of got out of the picture. And then we had no problems with Jordan. We have an international border, and they disregarded the Palestinians completely. They should have been the negotiator for peace with the Palestinians, but they just pulled out in order to protect themselves. So the peace with Jordan was a good achievement, but it was not based on some kind of compromises. It left us with the thing between us and Jordan. Now we Israelis send the Palestinians, Jordan is your state. It's been so until, I don't remember, 87, something like this. So you can go back to Jordan. And of course, that's not in the interest of King Abdallah. And Jordan is not an example. Jordan will be involved with the results of peace, not with the preconditions, and it will be less involved than ever before. And maybe Egypt too is not so anxious today to be mediating, because they're afraid of Islamization of the process and the conflict becoming a religious conflict. So that's why we should grab the Arab League proposal very quickly, because this includes these countries too.
Since you know Syria very well, a quick answer. Are they ready to do peace with Israel now?
I think right now they're consumed internally. But to be fair, if Bashar al-Assad had an idea of what he might get, then you might have a better understanding or better possibility of understanding whether he would be prepared to take a leap. In the year 2000, before the Intifada began, I can tell you that we had conversations with him, and the messages to us from him was he was prepared, in fact, to look at creative ways to solve what had been the main problem we had on where the border would be located.
I had Barak on my show, who negotiated with them, Ehud Barak, and he told me it really came down to a little bit of a line in the middle of the Kinneret or something like that.
It came down to a difference between 10 meters off the lake and what he was saying was about 400 meters off the lake. The truth is, that was a problem we could have fixed. We had 10 different creative ways to fix it. When the Intifada broke out, Bashar al-Assad came to us and said, look, I can't do anything now.
As long as there's a conflict in Syria, and as long as there's chaos, and Syria is completely wrapped up in its own internal problems, Syria is not going to be a player in any broader Palestinian-Israeli or Arab-Israeli reconciliation project. But also, Syria will not be involved in any bigger conflict with Israel.
Well, first of all, on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, Egypt has still the most critical role in the Arab world to play, and generally a constructive role to play, and they have generally played a constructive role, and they still will be called upon and they will be needed to play a constructive role, particularly in resolving the Palestinian problem.
I agree with you, by the way.
Now, the problem, as Dennis started alluding to it, is that right now there is a huge issue beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's one issue that's important, obviously consequential. But you have the entire region in a fluid situation where points in terms of reference is shifting. The Iraq war has had that consequence, the situation in Syria, the rise of sectarianism, the relationship with the U.S., the issue of continued significant Arab public resentment of American foreign policy shown in all the polling that the Egyptians have to deal with, the opening, the demands for democratization that Egypt is experiencing and dealing with. I've been 3 times to Egypt in the past few months. There is a feel that there's a demand for change. There's some change, but not enough, and the government hasn't figured out how to deal with it. And I think what we don't see in the entire region, and frankly, not in Israel, not in the Arab world, and I must say even at the global level, we don't see the kind of visionary leaders who are going to take risk, because what we see in the Middle East today is a crisis that if left to its own devices, it is going to be worse in a year and worse in 2 years.
That both of Israelis will always support a real leader who will come and say truly to his people, yes, I did it, I fought for that, I insisted on my interest, on our interest, on the security of Israel, but this is good for Israel, then he'll gain the same support as it was in 1978. But the atmosphere is totally different, and the Palestinian case is not the Egyptians, neither the Jordanian case.
One lacks a bold leader at this point to take the initiative, especially on the ground in the Middle East. I don't see who the figure is at the moment who can mimic Sadat's multiple breakthroughs. I think Sadat really used his domestic power and his authority in Egypt to do things that were clearly in the Egyptian national interest, but were considered politically incorrect in Egypt and in the Arab world.
I will take a break on that one, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about another personality in the Middle East who could be important and who may be in trouble, and that's the King of Jordan. We'll be right back.
Available now over iTunes, Amazon, and Google Play. Leon Charney's cantorial CD and Disco Lam. Listen as Charney movingly sings El Moleh Rachamim and Charney's amazing rendition of a disco remix of Adon Olam, all sung in the incredible and individual Charney style. Also listen to the CDs on Rhapsody. Download Leon Charney's cantorial songs and Disco Lam, the disco remix of Adon Olam on Amazon, iTunes, and Google Play. Or listen in on Rhapsody. All available now. In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high to have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Now get the book the hit movie was based on, Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels. Learn about the Backdoor Channel negotiations that led to the historic 1978 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Become a witness to history and order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Also available at all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at iTunes or Audible.com. Relive history. Order Backdoor Channels.
We're back, and I'm Leon Charney, and I have an illustrious bunch of people with me today who really know the Middle East very well. Give me your take quickly on the King of Jordan. Is he in trouble?
I just came back from Amman, and one of the things I'm struck by is that there is a very genuine effort to begin to build a much stronger basis of reform there, recognizing that one of the ways to create a better future for Jordan is going to depend on that. What is clearly a factor that influences and affects Jordan is the reality of what happens to the Palestinians, because such a significant part of their own population is Palestinian. So the king is struggling to try to deal with a country that in many ways doesn't have many resources, has had an influx of a large number of Iraqis who have also brought a lot of cash.
Right.
There's a boom right now in Jordan, but it's also feeding a lot of speculation in the real estate market. He's trying to take what is an influx of cash, he's trying to shape a new approach to reform. He understands what has to happen. That's all to the good. He still has to deal with this context in which he's operating, which is a Palestinian context which can clearly affect his choices and his future.
Shibly, let me ask you a question. Is it possible to get a democracy in the Middle East, in an Arab country?
No doubt.
You believe in that policy?
Well, so look, I mean, if you look at the Palestinian election, which takes place in a very difficult environment, and with limitations, you had a large majority of the population participate. You had real contentious politics. You had the opposition party actually win. I don't think democracy is going to come from the outside. I don't think the fact that the Palestinians had an election had anything to do with us. And in fact, we were actually trying not to have them have elections while Arafat was there because we were worried he would win, and waited until after he died to allow the elections. It's got nothing to do with George Bush. But democracy certainly is possible. I want to talk about the King of Jordan.
Quickly, though, because...
Yes, but I do think that he is facing more difficulty than we're recognizing. The difficulty is that, look, he's made the cornerstone of his foreign policy his alliance with America and his peace treaty with Israel more than his father ever did. His father went up and down depending on public opinion. At a time when public opinion in his country more resentful of Israel and the United States than any time in the past. And focused on two issues that Jordanians care more than almost all other Arabs combined, and that is the Palestinian issue and the Iraq. And he's facing that, and that's a lot to face at a time when you have a rise in the Islamic movement across the region, and he's going into a contentious relationship with Hamas. He's not popular.
Avraham.
I think one aspect that has not been very much publicized recently is growing gaps between the royal family and the Jordanian elite. This has been going on for the Jordanian elite. Usually when we talk about the Jordanian royal family or the Jordanian regime, we think about this rift between Palestinians and Jordanians.
Right.
But in the last few years, there has been a growing resentment among retired officers, among Jordanians who for generations were very much in kind of an alliance with the royal family, and they were considered the pillar of the regime. And in the more recent years, there have been a number of indications that something going wrong there. And even though the king has been trying very much to appease many of them by all kinds of jobs and opportunities, but there is a growing organization of those people who, for economic reasons, for loss of prestige, find themselves in a need to sort of protest or state their opinion, not against the regime, but they are definitely very unsatisfied.
That's it. You've heard it all from the Leon Charney Report. We'll see you next week. I want to thank Marshall Robbins-Wilf for Yeshiva University and everybody in the audience. And we'll see you next week with another show.